It's funny how one moment can change everything. 1 second, I was just a regular person driving home from my late-night shift at a bar in Toronto. The next, I was in the middle of something so dark, so twisted, I still can't shake it off. Even now, months later, it feels like something's following me, something I can't explain. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was driving along the 401, heading towards Scarborough where I lived. The roads were mostly empty, just a few trucks here and there. I was exhausted, my eyes heavy, and I just wanted to get home. That's when I saw it. Something on the side of the road. A car pulled over, nothing unusual at first. But as I drove past, I noticed a figure stumbling away from the car. It was a man, tall, and he was moving in a strange, uneven way. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was he hurt? Did he need help? But then I saw it. There was a woman lying in a ditch by the side of the road. Her body was still, unmoving. I couldn't see her face, but I knew something was terribly wrong. I didn't want to get involved, I just wanted to go home. But my mind wouldn't let me ignore it. I picked up my phone, dialed 911, and tried to steady my shaky hands. The dispatcher answered, and I told her everything about the man, the woman, where I was. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and to wait for the police. But then something else happened. The man, the one I'd seen stumbling away, was walking toward my car now. His eyes, they were wild, unfocused, like he wasn't even looking at me but through me. My heart started to race. There was something about the way he moved, like he wasn't entirely there. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I locked the doors and started driving faster, not looking back. When I got home, my hands were still shaking. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it felt. But deep down, I knew. I knew I had seen something I shouldn't have. And that feeling, that unease, stuck with me. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. A police officer. He asked if I was the one who had called 911, and I said yes. He stepped inside, his face serious. He started asking me about what happened. I told him everything, just like I told 911. The man, the woman, the place, the time. The officer didn't interrupt, just nodded and jotted down notes. But then, he asked me something that made my stomach twist. "Are you sure it was by the 401, the Scarborough exit?" He asked, his voice calm but with a strange edge. "Of course," I said. "I saw her in the ditch. She wasn't moving. I thought she was dead." The officer frowned and looked down at his notes. There was no woman found there, no report of anything, no signs of a crime. My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I called 911. I saw her with my own eyes. She was right there." The officer just stared at me, silent for a moment. I could feel a chill creeping into the room, not from the air, but from the way he looked at me. "We've checked the area. There's nothing there. No woman, no man. No sign of any incident." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't. My mind was spinning. Maybe I had imagined it all. Number I knew what I saw. I could still feel the man's eyes on me, the way he moved, like he wasn't entirely human. The officer left, but that feeling lingered. It gnawed at me deeper than fear. It was like I'd stepped into a nightmare, but no one else could see it. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the unease never went away. A week later, a detective came by. His name was Detective Morrison, and he was polite but distant. He told me they'd done a follow-up investigation, and that they wanted to ask more questions. When I told him the same story, he seemed almost relieved, like I was confirming something for him. But when he looked at his notes, his face shifted. "You're sure you saw her on the side of the road? Because we've checked, and there's no sign of her. No reports." "I know what I saw," I said, my voice cracking. "She was right there. I couldn't have imagined it." He sighed. "I don't think you're imagining anything. But sometimes what we think we see isn't always the full picture. Then, in a quiet voice, he added, "We think the man you saw may be connected to some darker stuff." The woman? She wasn't just some random victim. She was involved in something much worse than you can imagine. My stomach churned. The way he said it, there was something in his voice, something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Like he knew more than he was telling me. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. It was like I was being fed pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. And the more I learned, the less I wanted to know. The detective left, but something in the back of my mind kept gnawing at me. What did he mean by darker stuff? What had I stumbled into? Why did it feel like I was being drawn into something I didn't understand? Weeks passed, and I never heard back from the police. The case went cold. The woman? She remained a mystery, but every time I drove that stretch of highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And it wasn't just the cars around me. It was a feeling in my gut like something or someone was always one step behind me. I don't know what happened that night, but I'll tell you this. Sometimes it's not the monsters we can see that are the most terrifying. It's the ones we can't. The ones that hide in plain sight, right behind the eyes of the people we trust. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I'm telling you, what happened to me, the way it messed with my mind, still makes me question my own sanity. I can't shake the feeling that the police were involved in something that I'll never fully understand. And what's worse, I think they knew I saw something I wasn't supposed to. It all started one night in Ottawa. I was just finishing up at my usual shift at the diner downtown. Nothing too late, maybe around 11 p.m. I was about to close when a man walked in. He was older than me, mid-40s maybe, scruffy, unkempt. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his clothes ragged, like he'd been living in them for far too long. He ordered a coffee, no food, just the coffee. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was something about the way he was looking at me. It wasn't the usual glance a customer gives their server. No, this felt different. Like he was sizing me up, staring through me, like he knew something that I didn't. I chalked it up to him just being weird, but as he sat there drinking his coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. At around midnight, I started cleaning up, getting ready to leave. I was locking up when I noticed him still sitting in the corner booth watching me. There was no sign of him moving, no sign of leaving. I started to feel uncomfortable, like he was waiting for me to do something, like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong. I decided to step outside for some fresh air before heading home, hoping the cool air would clear my head. As soon as I stepped outside, I saw a black car parked across the street, its headlights on but dimmed. A police car, I assumed, but something about it felt off. I glanced at it, and that's when I saw the man from the diner. He was standing across the street, just watching me. His eyes were cold, empty. I was about to cross the street when I heard someone call my name. "Excuse me, miss." I turned around, a cop, the one in the black car. He had a stern expression, but there was something unsettling about his presence. He told me they had received a report of suspicious activity in the area and asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I told him no, nothing that stood out. But his eyes, they never left mine, like he was trying to read me, and the longer he stared, the more I started to question myself. Had I seen something? Had I done something? I tried to walk away, but he stopped me, asking if I wanted a ride home. I told him no, I was fine, just trying to get to my car. But then, out of nowhere, I felt this weird compulsion to get in, like my body wasn't my own. I told myself it was nothing, just my overactive imagination. But the man's gaze, the way he wouldn't break eye contact, made my skin crawl. When I finally got to my car, I looked back to see that black car still parked, its headlights now off. No sign of the cop, no sign of the man. I brushed it off as a weird encounter and headed home. But that was just the beginning. Over the next week, I kept seeing the same car parked in the same spot, always at night, always with the headlights off. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a coincidence. But then I saw it again. And again. The black car. The same officer or someone who looked like him. And sometimes I would hear whispers, just faint enough to make me question if they were real. I even thought I heard my name being called in the middle of the night. But when I checked, no one was there. I tried to go to the police station to ask about the officer who had stopped me. But when I got there, no one knew who I was talking about. The officer, the car, the suspicious activity, none of it was in the system. It didn't exist. And that's when the paranoia started to set in. Was I losing my mind? A few days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me answer. "Miss?" A voice on the other end said. It was a deep, gruff voice, like someone trying to hide their identity. "I think you've seen too much." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice cracked. There was a long pause before the voice continued. "You're not safe anymore. You should have left that night. Now they're watching." I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. The words were getting stuck in my throat. "Who is this?" I asked, but all I heard was a click as the call ended. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was too much to ignore. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see that car. Every time I stepped outside, I expected to see that officer's cold eyes staring at me. The whispers grew louder, more persistent. Sometimes I could hear them even when I was in my apartment. Quiet voices just out of earshot, like someone was just behind the walls. The worst part? It felt like no matter what I did, I couldn't escape. I tried changing my routine. I tried taking different routes home. But every time I saw that black car, every time I felt that cold, unblinking stare, I couldn't tell if it was all in my head or if something far more sinister was at play. One night, I decided to confront it. I drove past the usual spot, the place where the black car always parked. But tonight, there was something different. The car wasn't there. Instead, the street was completely empty. But as I turned the corner, I swear I saw that officer standing in the shadows, waiting. That was the moment I realized there was something more than just paranoia happening, something darker, something connected to the police, or at least someone pretending to be them. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm being followed or if I'm just losing my grip on reality, but I can't escape the feeling that something is watching me, that someone, maybe even the police, knows what I saw that night, and they're waiting for me to make the wrong move. And that's the scariest part. The scariest part is that I'm starting to wonder if I ever really left that diner, or if I'm still stuck in whatever nightmare they've created for me. It all started with a routine traffic stop. I never expected that a simple misunderstanding could spiral into something so wrong. I was living in a small town just outside of Calgary where everyone knows everyone. Or at least that's what I thought. Life here was slow, peaceful even. So when I saw the flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror late one night, my heart sank. I wasn't speeding, I wasn't doing anything illegal, but for some reason my instincts told me something wasn't right. I pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down my window, trying to keep my cool. The officer approached, his face hidden behind the dark uniform and shadow of his hat. He didn't seem threatening at first, just doing his job. He asked for my license and registration, which I handed over. He glanced at my documents, then back at me. "You've been drinking tonight, miss?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. I shook my head. "No, officer, just a long day at work. I'm heading home." He nodded but didn't hand my documents back immediately. His eyes lingered on me a little too long, making me uncomfortable. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said after a long silence. I did as he asked, trying not to show how rattled I was. Why did he want me out of the car? What was going on? "Are you feeling okay?" he asked, eyeing me like he was looking for something. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just tired," I replied, my voice coming out a little shakier than I intended. The officer didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he walked around my car, peering into the windows. I felt my chest tighten with anxiety. Something about his movements didn't seem right. He was too deliberate, too careful. After a minute, he returned to me, his face unreadable. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe you've been involved in an incident recently. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" I froze. My blood ran cold. What? An incident? What the hell was he talking about? I don't understand, I stammered, my voice nearly faltering. The officer's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play games. We know you were at the scene." I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I tried to stay composed, but my mind was racing. What scene? What was he talking about? "I think you're mistaken. I've been home all day," I managed to say, but even I didn't sound convincing. The officer studied me, his face unreadable. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I've seen you before. You've been near that house, haven't you?" I was starting to lose control of the situation. What house? My mind was spinning. I had no idea what he was talking about. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my throat dry, trying to back away from him. "Please, officer, I don't know what this is about. I've never been to any house." But he was insistent. He was almost too insistent. "Don't lie, you were there. I saw you." He took a step closer, his presence suddenly feeling overwhelming. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The house near the old mill, just outside of town. You've been there, haven't you?" I stood there, frozen, my legs shaking. I was trying to piece together anything I could, but nothing clicked. There was no house near an old mill. There was nothing. But the officer was looking at me like he knew something that I didn't. I started feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. Had I been to a house I didn't remember? Why did he sound so sure? "I've never been to that place, I swear," I pleaded, now desperate. My pulse was racing, my vision blurry. The officer's tone shifted. He was no longer calm or professional. His voice was colder now, almost sinister. "Ma'am, you're lying, and I don't like liars." I felt like I was suffocating. The air around me seemed thicker. It was as if he was controlling the situation, leading me into this terrifying, unshakable paranoia. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't focus on his face anymore. All I could think about was the terror creeping up my spine. "I need to go," I managed to say, taking a step back. The officer didn't stop me. He didn't need to. He knew that the fear he had planted inside me was more than enough. I got back in my car and drove off, but the entire drive home felt like I was being followed. Every mirror, every streetlight, every shadow on the side of the road felt like his gaze was on me. It was as if his presence had infected everything around me. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept running through the conversation. The way the officer had looked at me, the way he knew things he shouldn't have known. My skin crawled every time I tried to think of the incident he'd mentioned. I tried to convince myself it was all a misunderstanding, that I was just exhausted, that it was all in my head. But then, the next day, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the news, a report came up about a woman who had been found unconscious near an abandoned house, not far from the old mill. The police were looking for a woman matching my description. It was like a gut punch. How could they think it was me? I didn't know what to believe anymore. Had I actually been to that house? Had something happened to me that I couldn't remember? Or was I being framed? I tried to call the police station asking about the officer from last night, but when I described him, no one knew who I was talking about. It was like he didn't exist. It was like the conversation had never happened. I felt like I was losing my mind. But the worst part? It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing the officer everywhere. I'd catch glimpses of him in parking lots, in grocery store aisles, on street corners. Each time, he would just stare at me, a cold, knowing stare that made my skin crawl. But when I tried to approach, he was always gone, as if he had never been there. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if there's something truly sinister happening in this small town. But I'm starting to think the officer knows more about me than I do, and that thought is terrifying.